Welcome to the World Energy Council's German chapter. My name is Carsten Rolle. I'm the Secretary General of the German chapter, and in fact, I have the honor of guiding you a little bit through the next 1 and something hours through our webinar, Energy and Transition Global Perspectives. This webinar is a sort of sneak preview of our annual publication, Energy for Germany. We are going to publish on July 10th in another webinar with the main topic on CCS and global trends in CCS, a topic that might play quite a role this year in Germany with the legal framework that is going to come. But today, we want to focus global trends in energy of the last 12 months. And we are going to do this with the expertise of the 2 colleagues from Enerdata, who were taking care of this chapter of Energy for Germany this year. And we're very grateful to have Géraldine Duffour, the analyst of Enerdata, here with us, and Quentin Bchini, head of research and development of Enerdata. Both of them will guide us through this first 20 to 30 minutes. And after that, we were going to have a comment by Dr. Sabrina Schulz. She is the Director Germany of the European Initiative for Energy Security and as well adjunct professor of the Heute School here in Berlin. So with no further ado, I'd like to hand it over to the both of you, Géraldine, Quentin, to give us an insight. What was new? What were the basic trends in energy the last year globally?
Thank you, Carsten. I will share my screen. Do you see it?
You can see it very good.
Okay, great. So let's have a few words about Enerdata first. We're taking the opportunity just to say a few words about our company. So we are a small company based in Grenoble in the French Alps with people everywhere, and also a small subsidiary in Singapore. We are about 70 person.
行吗？哎，这只法国人英语还卡一。
Oops. We are a spin-off of a French university lab, which created a database on energy So we have continued to manage to expand and develop this database. So we have statistics from 1970 and to 2024. And we also have a modeling team, whose Quentin could talk more specifically. So we make a forecast for energy consumption, demand, prices up to 2050. We are very focused on energy and climate matters. We also make analysis on energy efficiency. So we are increasingly focusing on energy, climate, and from the past to the future. So Quentin could tell more about it. So I will make the presentation, and if you have any question, you can ask to both of us. So energy trends in 2024 in a few words. In 2024, we had a 3% economic growth. This was the global trend, the average trend over the long-term period between 2010 and 2019. So we tried to avoid the COVID-19 crisis in 2020 and the rebound years following. So the long-term period for us is up to 2019. Back to normal economic growth. And in 2024, a 2% growth in energy consumption. So here it's energy consumption all included, including energy used in power plants, in the power sector, in refining, in LNG, liquefaction, and so on. So the total energy consumption grew by 2%. It is slower than in 2023, which was still a rebound year, but it's much faster than over the long term. So we have a smaller energy consumption, a slower energy consumption compared to GDP, but still it's faster than the long term. So energy consumption is still growing. Consumption grew for all energy types, especially electricity, which grew by nearly 4%, which is much faster than over the long term, much faster than in 2023. It's also included, so this higher in electricity demand boosted demand for gas, which grew by 3%. This is faster than the long term, which was already quite fast, and for coal, which continued to increase in 2024 at a much faster rate than over the 2010-2019 period. There was only a small exception for oil, whose consumption slightly declined by less than 1%. We will see the drivers for this slight drop, but it's more stabilization rather than a decline. So let's have a focus on economic growth, which is one of the main drivers for energy demand in the G20 countries. So as in previous years, so the economic growth was about 3%, and it was driven by non-OECD countries, especially emerging countries such as China, India, Indonesia, which overall grew by nearly 5%. So in China, the growth was still very high, 5%, like in 2023. This is lower than over the long-term period due to the lingering impacts of the real estate crisis, which harmed industrial sectors, the real estate sector first, and other depending sectors, and had a deterring effect on consumer confidence. So this is why the Chinese economy is not sluggish, but still rising not as fast as it used to do. The growth was also very strong in India. So India is it's developing very fast by more than 5% per year. In Indonesia too, in Brazil, and even in Russia, despite Western sanctions, because of strong public investments in industry and in the military sector. So the GDP grew in all non-OECD countries except for Argentina, which is still hit by economic crisis, very high inflation. So. On the other hand, the GDP grew, but at a slower pace in OECD. It was very dynamic in the US with 3%. This is above the long-term trend. But in the rest of the OECD countries, the growth was slower, especially in the EU, with only 1%. It's still better than in 2023, but it's not a very fast economic growth. And there was even a stagnation in Germany, which is the most important country in the EU in terms of economic growth. There was also a slowdown in other countries, a stagnation in Japan, and slower growth in Turkey, which was booming in the last years. So what we can remember is that non-OECD countries are the driver for economic growth, and they are nearly half of the G20 GDP, with China accounting for 1/4 alone. And India also is booming with 10% of the global GDP, the G20 GDP. So this economic growth had a strong impact on primary energy consumption, which grew by 2% and was spurred by non-OECD economies. So non-OECD economies now represent 60% of the G20 energy consumption. So they're really gaining weight, especially China, which alone accounts for more than 1/3 of the G20 energy consumption, 35%. This is twice as much as the US, and it's rising very fast. India energy consumption is also rising and now accounts for 10%. This is as much as the EU. So India must really be taken into account when talking about energy consumption. So this growth was spurred by non-OECD economies, with China, whose energy consumption grew by 4%, in India by 5%, and Indonesia too, 6%. These are really developing economies. On the other hand, energy consumption grew at a slower rate in OECD countries. It was stagnating in 2024 after 2 years of decline. So it could be it could be an improvement, but still energy consumption is really growing at a slow pace. It was only 1% in the US and stable in the EU, and even a slight drop in Japan, back to the usual trend. So if we focus on energy mixes, how this primary energy consumption is broken down, we can see that coal is still the main energy consumed with 1/3. So it's 33% in 2024. It was almost the same in 2010. So there was a slight decrease in oil consumption to the advantage of gas. And what we can see also is that primary electricity consumption. So primary electricity is electricity you can produce without using other sources of energy, such as nuclear, hydropower, wind, solar, or geothermal. So despite the boom in renewables, this share of primary electricity in total energy consumption is only increasing at slightly from 9% in 2010 to 11% in 2024. So coal remains the largest fuel, the most consumed fuel in the G20 countries. So this is due to the fact that China and India and Indonesia, in a lesser extent, are using huge amounts of coal. So coal consumption continued to rise in 2024 by 2%, and it was due to China and India. So non-OECD countries, they account for nearly 90% of coal consumption in the G20, with China accounting for more than 60% and India for 40%. In those two countries, so in China, India, and Indonesia, there are huge coal producers, so they are using their resources. A large part of their power generation fleet is based on coal, so it takes a long time to change and to transition to other energy sources. So these three countries accounted for most of the increase in coal consumption. Also in South Africa, which was hit in the last year by technical problems in coal-fired power plants. So in 2024, these technical problems improved and coal consumption rebounded in this country. On the other hand, so we can see that in China and India, there is a slight slowdown in coal consumption compared to 2023, which was due to the competition of other fuels of renewables in the power sector, which reduced the need for or at least that slowed down coal consumption. And on the other hand, when you're watching OECD countries, you can see that coal consumption continues to decline. Not as fast as in 2023, but at a faster rate than over the long-term period. So this is due to coal phase-out policies with replacement, with substitution of coal-fired power plants by gas-fired power plants and especially renewable parks. So coal demand fell by 7% in the US, by 13% in the EU, even in gas where the coal-to-gas substitution is operating. In South Korea, over very high nuclear power generation, and in the UK. In the UK, it's just marginal, but the country closed its last coal-fired power plants in 2024. So really, in the OECD countries, the coal phase-out policies are really responsible for this fall in coal consumption. If we have a look at coal price trends from Australia and South Africa, we can see that there was a stabilization in 2024 after the surge in 2021, 2022, and the fall in 2023. But still, so coal prices were lower in 2024, but remain nearly half above, 50% above, or up to 75% above than 2019 level. So coal prices are lower, but still higher than before. So let's have a look at oil. There was a slight decline in oil consumption in 2024. This is due to a slowdown in the US, which is the largest market for oil, for crude oil, total oil consumption. So the US accounts for 23% of oil demand in the G20. In the US, there was a slight decline in road transport due to less commuting, more remote work, and also efficiency progress, energy efficiency improvements in road transport, the competition of electric vehicles. Meanwhile, there was also a growth in the petrochemical sector. So overall, there was only a 1% increase in the US. This is slower than in 2023. In China, there was a slight decrease. So oil consumption dipped by 0.6% in China. This is the same amount as the G20. China is the second largest oil consumer in the G20. So this slight decrease is due to a stable oil product consumption, because in 2023 China totally terminated its COVID-19 related restrictions. So in 2023, road transport and domestic aviation boomed. Everyone took the opportunity to travel, to visit family. The transport sector rose. So even for industry, for trade. So there was really a boom in 2023 and in 2024, just back to normal and a stable consumption for oil products. And this contributed to a slight decline in refinery throughputs. So overall, crude oil consumption and oil consumption in China slightly declined. It continued to grow in other countries, such as India, which is really developing with a strong economic growth. So oil consumption grew in India. In OECD countries, it was declining, slight decline in the EU, in Japan, due to industrial slowdown or difficulties. So if we have a look at crude oil prices, we see that as for coal, prices stabilized in 2024, but remain much higher than before the crisis, before the COVID crisis. So for gas, it was the same for gas prices. A surge in 2021, 2022, a drastic fall in 2023, especially for Europe, and a stabilization, but at significantly higher levels in 2024. So gas prices are about 28% higher than in 2019. Sorry. So gas consumption grew in 2024 by 3%. This is faster than over the long-term period. And it was due to a strong rebound in non-OECD countries, especially in Russia, which is one of the largest gas consumer in the G20. So Russia's gas production grew by 7%. And the country implemented a gasification program and tried to use gas, replaced boilers, boosted gas-fired generation. So there was a strong growth in Russia. In China and India, plus 7% each, with strong demand from the power sector. And together they accounted for 1/3 of the G20 gas demand. There was also a strong demand in other countries. Even in OECD countries, there was a slight rebound by nearly 2%. A strong growth in the United States, whose gas production increased. There is a strong demand from the power sector because electricity consumption grew in the US over many factors that we will see just after. Strong demand from the power sector, which raised gas consumption. Also in Canada, where the coal-fired power plants are replaced by gas. In South Korea, in Germany too, over lower prices, and decline in other countries. But we can see that gas consumption grew at a very fast pace last year. So electricity consumption, it grew by nearly 4% in 2024. It was led by two countries, namely China and the US, plus 7% in China, plus 2% in the US. These are the two largest consuming countries for electricity, and there were the four same drivers for this growth. A high demand from industry, especially from data centers. So this contributed to the growth. Building cooling, because two countries as India were hit by heat waves, and electric vehicle charging. So these trends that we see, these trends are really What we can say about electricity, electric mobility, electric EV charging, data centers, which appear to be new trends, they're already happening and already have strong effects in China and the US. So beside China and the US, there was also a strong growth in non-OECD countries by 6%, especially in India, which is still electrifying and has a strong economic growth and strong industrial demand. In Brazil, in Indonesia. Meanwhile, there was a slower growth in OECD. It grew by 1.5%, with a 1% growth in the EU and a stable demand in Japan and South Korea. So as for energy consumption overall, or GDP overall, electricity consumption is booming in non-OECD countries and growing at a slower rate in OECD countries. If we have a look at the power mixes, we can see that nearly 60% of this electricity production is based on fossil fuels, especially on coal. So the share of fossil fuels in the power mix has been declining from nearly 66% in 2010 to just below 60% in 2024. So you have 60% fossil fuels, 30% renewables, and 10% nuclear. But despite booming renewable power generation, we had a nearly 30% increase in solar generation in 2024, 8% increase in wind generation, a 6% increase in hydropower, and a 3% growth in nuclear. So despite this growth, this strong growth in carbon-free power generation, thermal generation continued to increase by 1%. So this rise in renewable generation is not replacing fossil fuels. It's on top of fossil fuels. So this growth in thermal generation remains, it's not growing as fast as thermal power generation is not growing as fast as renewables. So this share is eroding, but still, it's still growing. So to have a note of hope, we can have a short focus on wind and solar power generation and capacities. So in 2024, solar and wind installation surged, like in the year before, and this growth was driven by China. So overall, in the G20, there were more than 400 gigawatts of new solar capacities led by China, with almost 280 gigawatts of solar capacity, nearly 70% of the global installation or the G20 installation. A slight slowdown in wind capacity additions, with more than 100 gigawatts installed. And China, once again, accounting for 3/4 of these installations, 80 gigawatts installed in China. So China is leading global installation for wind and solar. The other markets are the EU, with a slight slowdown in 2024, the US, where they remain steady, and India. And it's not in the graph, but India installed over 25 gigawatts of solar in 2024. So these massive installations in China translated into the country doubling its solar capacity between 2022 and 2024. So China doubled its solar capacity in 2 years, and now accounts for half of the G20 solar capacity. This had an impact on power generation. You can see that the G20, well, at least China's solar generation and wind generation are booming. As for wind, China accounts for 40% of the G20 wind power generation. So you have 40% China, 20% the US, 20% EU, and 20% other G20 country. So China alone produces as much as the EU and the US. It's the same for solar, with China producing 44% of the G20 solar generation. This is as much as the EU, the US, India, and Japan altogether. So thanks to China for these installations and this renewable generation. So As I said, this renewable generation is on top of thermal power generation, and CO2 emission continue to increase by 1%. As for thermal generation, it was a slower growth compared to 2023, but still emissions are still increasing, and they were spurred by China and India, which together account for more than half of G20 emissions. They slowed down compared to 2023, but still, since their power mixes and energy mixes are very CO2 intensive, they had a strong impact on emissions. It's also the case for Indonesia, whose emissions grew by nearly 8% due to the strong weight of coal in their energy mixes. In OECD countries whose emissions are slightly declining, this was the impact of the coal phase-out policies and higher renewable generation. So renewable generation contributed to slow down emissions, but did not stop them. There was a slight decrease in the US, in EU, and in Japan. In Japan, it was also due to a revival of nuclear power generation in South Korea too. So we can see that there is a slowdown, but still increasing. And due to the CO2 emissions that are related to energy are still increasing, whereas we should be cutting them to reach a 2-degree pathway. So as a summary, we can remember that 3-2-1, we had a 3% increase in GDP, a 2% increase in energy consumption, global energy consumption, and a 1% increase in CO2 emissions. So energy demand keeps rising faster than over the long term. This is spurring CO2 emissions and making the 2-degree pathway increasingly difficult to reach. In our forecasts, it's increasingly unrealistic to reach this 2-degree pathway. This is due to the weight of fossil fuels, especially coal, but also gas, whose consumption is rising, and oil, since they remain dominant with 80% of the energy mix and almost 60% of the power mixes. This is in spite of booming solar and wind generation, installation, and power generation, but thermal power generation continues to increase and to push CO2 emissions. If we have a focus on which countries are leading the game, it's really China, India, and Indonesia to a lesser extent, which account for half of the G20's energy consumption, over 80% of its coal consumption, and 55% of the CO2 emissions. So China is installing most of the new wind and solar new capacities, and account for more than 40%, but still CO2 emissions are continuing to grow. That's all, if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Géraldine, for this impressive overview. Yeah, I think that was most interesting, both in the trends that you described, but also in the very structural fundamentals, the weight of different continents and countries that has shifted over the years. So there's a sort of new geography and energy that you also highlighted, and that alludes a bit to Daniel Jürgen's thesis of the new energies that mostly add up rather than substitute each other over time globally. So the hunger for energy needs actually many energies at once, fossils as well as renewables, with high dynamics in both of them. Before we go into the discussion and also allow for questions, we now have a first comment by Sabrina. Dr. Sabrina Schulz, and yeah, I'd hand it over to you immediately to put this a bit into a broader picture geopolitically and also in another sense. Please go ahead, Sabrina.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Carsten. And thank you, Géraldine, for this very slight note of hope towards the end. I guess that for most of us who've spent a significant time of our professional lives on the energy transition, most of these trends are pretty devastating, and they are part of a completely new geopolitical game. We have a breakdown of multilateralism, we have systemic rivalry, multipolarity, and so on. So let me focus on Europe and think through the opportunities that arise for us. And let's not forget that other regions might indeed follow the European example if we make the energy transition work and if we prove there's actually a business case. So my first of 5 theses is, the biggest mistake at this stage would probably be linear thinking. Technological opportunities, technological development will open up new opportunities that societies then need to seize, and geopolitical developments are forcing us, in particular here in Europe, to do things that we probably never imagined doing. Just think about the energy crisis in 2022. So let me share with you some reflections. Talking geopolitics, for Europe, it's now a matter of completely rethinking our energy supplies from an energy security perspective. In a way, spending hundreds of billions of euros every year on imported fossil fuels, making ourselves dependent on volatile energy markets, doesn't really seem like a very rational choice any longer. If we think about the Israeli attacks on Iran's oil and gas infrastructure, it should really be a wake-up call. Energy markets are global, so any disruption affects importing countries wherever they are. And think about it. I mean, the region around the Strait of Hormuz is home to half of the world's oil reserves. The largest gas field in the world, South Pass, is located in the region. So any disruption of supply routes will translate directly into higher energy prices for Europe at a time when we're struggling really badly already with competitiveness. So thesis number 2, first one was about linear thinking. Let's not do it. Thesis number 2, in Europe, we really have to start putting our money where our mouth is. We have to invest in domestic energy, and we have to invest in energy infrastructure that makes our system secure and resilient. So I'm just thinking at a time of unprecedented spending on defense, let's not forget energy infrastructure is already being attacked on a regular basis. So energy security is part of our overall defense efforts. And the more distributed we can make our energy systems and the better we protect them against cyber attacks, the more resilient they become. Interruptions to energy supplies and energy price shocks, as we all remember, have already wreaked havoc back in 2022, and we can avoid this in the future, and it's about political choices. So my thesis number 3 is, it's not only about money, it's also about policies, and it's about industrial policy. And these ultimately need to serve to make the energy transition a business case. For the Germans among us, you may remember that our German energy minister, Katharina Reiche, has launched a new debate on the role of the social market economy. The social market economy was designed by Ludwig Erhard at a time when there was money, when there were resources, workers, demand. The money was also coming from the Marshall Fund. The question today is, how do we combine a social market economy with industrial policy in the energy sector? So to follow the logic of the presentation, let me just quickly say a few things about gas, oil, and electricity. So investments and policies are necessary in the gas sector when it comes to weaning the heating sector of imported fossil fuels. So this mainly, of course not exclusively, means electrification of the heating sector, for example, via heat pumps or district heating. It's a lot about regulatory certainty. we know regulation sends hopefully the right signals to the market. And if I know that there is a natural cut-off point for new gas furnaces, I will hardly decide to buy a new one. And it's also about incentive schemes and financial support benefiting everyone, homeowners and tenants. And investment and policies are also necessary for the decarbonization of industry. We could have a longer discussion now about the role of hydrogen. Let's not go into this because there are still lots of question marks behind market ramp up and the relevant timeframes. But there's clearly also a trend pointing towards the direct electrification of industry. And I think it's definitely worth pursuing. So next point, oil. So obviously, to wean ourselves off imported oil, we need to accelerate the EV transition. And to achieve this eventually and finally, we also need a policy mix. So we need incentives and policies to drive consumer demand and to boost EV adoption. And in Germany, we realized subsidies do make a difference. When subsidies stopped pretty much overnight in 2023 because of budgetary issues, EV sales dropped dramatically, pretty much all of a sudden as well. We also need way more investments in charging infrastructure. We have to make it really easy to use it. The EV transition, however, is also a direct function of onshoring battery supply chains into Europe, because simply relying on China is not safe in the long term. And this in and of itself requires a whole policy toolbox. It takes research and innovation in next-gen batteries and in battery recycling. It takes public investment in gigafactories, in software, recycling, and other issues. It's about securing resources. So if you think about all the lithium, the cobalt, the nickel, the copper, the rare earths we need for battery supply chains, we realize that, yeah, the Critical Raw Materials Act of the EU is going in the right direction, but it's now all about implementation. It's about domestic mining, it's about domestic processing, it's about the diversification of suppliers and supply routes. It's about partnerships with resource-rich countries. It's about recycling. And interestingly, the same resources that are necessary for onshoring battery supply chains are also the ones that are necessary for onshoring renewables value chains to Europe, and also, of course, for the defense sector. On electricity, there is now an active debate happening in Germany about slowing down the energy transition because electricity demand might not be increasing to the extent that was projected. But then in the report that Géraldine presented, it's very explicit. We do have higher electricity demand from industry and data centers, from households, from commercial consumers for heating and cooling, and of course for EV charging. So my thesis number 4 is slowing down the rollout of renewables and the integration of renewables would clearly be sending the wrong signals to the market. So we would be even further away from making renewables into a business case, or the energy transition into a business case. Thesis number 5, let's be very quick about this. Let's not forget about energy efficiency. We all know how important it is, but it has become somewhat less attractive as a solution in the policy toolbox. So to sum up for Europe, the current situation is about domestic energy, mainly renewables. It's not just about capacity, it's about the meaningful integration of renewables. So investment in grid infrastructure and storage, interconnection across Europe, permitting reform, designing markets that reward flexibility and resilience and efficiency. So what the European example shows is that there really is a lot we can do. And I do confess it's probably a bit less straightforward with energy-hungry geographies in Asia, in particular China, India, Indonesia. But let's not give up on multilateralism, international cooperation, diplomacy, mutual learning. in Europe in particular, we know how this works. And I do believe that we need to double down on our efforts to engage in energy transition diplomacy. Now, outside the G20, financial resources are clearly one of the biggest challenges. And this is happening at a time when ODA funds are diminishing severely and drastically. But I guess this is a topic for another event. We already heard it, Carsten, you mentioned it, the recent article in Foreign Affairs by Dan Jurgen and others, where the authors say that the energy transition is really more of an energy addition, because we've kept adding new resources or new energy sources to the system. We haven't been able to eliminate others. The article ends on the notion that a linear transition is not possible. But it also says somewhere else that technological innovation has been central to every evolution in energy production. So yes, the transition does involve trade-offs, but I would encourage everyone here in the webinar and in policy making, investors and analysts to not take this as a given. Yeah, a linear transition is not possible, and this opens up opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. That was already quite a strong political statement, and your conclusions on all the analysis Géraldine has drawn out. In fact, I'd like to come back for a minute to the analysis and to the trends that we've heard before we come into discussion, and all the audience and the participants are invited to raise their hands or write a comment in the chat, whatever you like. But to both of you, maybe the question, once we heard all these trends, what was the most surprising one? I mean, we heard on every primary energy and electricity and carbon, region by region, what was going on, how the weight of the regions has shifted over time. I still think how impressive the role, the small and the decreasing role of Europe in all of that picture. When you've alluded to the dynamics in Indonesia and India and China and their role in the global energy game today, that is so different from just a couple of years ago. What is then the prospect for the next years to come with these dynamics that we've seen? Géraldine, maybe if you would have to give us an outlook for the next 2 or 3 years, what would you expect? Where are the uncertainties where we should look at?
Hello, I may jump in here. I'm Anadata's head of marketing, Christian Mollert. Hi, Carsten, and thanks to you and team for organizing this webinar. Yeah, I guess this is more of a question for Quentin, our head of research, who hopefully is among the audience. Quentin, are you still here? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Christian, for that. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure, Géraldine could also, I guess, answer, but this was initially a 2-part presentation where we also put these figures in perspective with long-term energy scenarios that we are producing. So I guess it's more closely related to that area, but Géraldine, feel free to jump in and say something also about the historical trends, especially I thought the question about what was surprising, I don't, in terms of the trends that we've observed in 2024, I can't say that I'm surprised, because, I mean, the surprise in itself is that it keeps going, or even as Géraldine pointed out, we even have a stronger increase in energy demand as we observed between 2010 and 2019. Now, obviously, you have to, and Géraldine did this very well, you have to consider what are the regional trends. But the general observation that nothing is changing despite the objective and the emergency that we're in is a surprise in itself, I would say. But in fact, if you go into like regional dynamics, you can't really say that nothing is changing, really. There are things happening, but at a pace that is way too slow. And in terms of perspectives, I mean, we can't really, we're not really producing forecasts as much as we're producing scenarios, right? What needs to happen, especially if we want to reach the targets that we've set ourselves in terms of climate. And we have produced scenarios one scenario that looks at countries basically fulfilling their NDC pledges, and one scenario which is basically just trying to maintain the increase in temperature below 2 degrees Celsius. And we've seen that like basically the trends that we're observing year after year, we are just pushing back on the efforts that need to be implemented. And this is very, very scary, because now the slope to get to a trajectory that is compatible with these objectives is getting steeper and steeper. And well, I can say unrealistic at this stage, but it does seem to be getting more and more difficult to reach. So yeah, to answer the first question, and if you want to jump in also, Géraldine, I would say that the surprise is that nothing really seems to be happening, at least on a top level. And what we need to be observing is a really a shift, an actual shift, which could be brought up by Sabrina mentioned a lot of things that could happen, especially really shifting technologies such as EVs, for example, that could introduce a major change in terms of both electrifications, but also energy efficiency and that sort of things. So you could see, as it's not going to be a linear process, I guess, it's to use the words that Sabrina used. So it doesn't mean that it's unrealistic, but it is really worrying that we are getting further and further away from the ideal path in terms of decarbonization.
In a global trend, especially if you look at the dynamics of renewables, Europe, rest of the world, especially China. That was, I think, quite amazing how fast China and was really not catching up, but really going forward in both wind and solar, and integrating these energies in the energy system, which is a challenge in itself, of course, that we're also having. Sabrina, do you like to...
Sorry, just if I may add up, I think, Quentin, last year you did an insightful analysis on the burden sharing, because in the end, there is always the question as to who's going to pay for the transition, and that is, on the agenda for most COPs, and and due to the increasing share of China, India, Indonesia, and the non-OECD countries in energy consumption, it's always the question of who's going to pay. So there was a glimpse of hope, at the last COP about some fund that was put together in terms of the OECD countries financing the non-OECD country to decarbonize. But in the end, there's such a small amount. I mean, there should be at least 10 times this amount, because otherwise, if we don't set up this type of scheme, non-OECD countries will keep saying, the West, you've been emitting CO2 for a century, so why should we pay for decarbonization? So yeah, there are some glimpses of hopes like this fund which was set up, but there needs to be much more implemented, and this is not only on the world policy level, but also at the technology level. I mean, the investments, etc. Because there's the other issue is how to finance this and how to get the financial institutions to actually put money on the table to finance the transition. Well, this is a huge debate.
Alluding to the jet piece, to countries like Indonesia that we've seen, in fact, are one of the key drivers of the rising coal demand with the dynamics that you've just shown. Sabrina, there's a question to you in the chat. I think it's sort of, is there a conflict between diversification on the one hand side and then making sure that our gas supply will not rely too heavily on certain countries. Do you want to react on that?
Yes, absolutely. Very briefly, I just want to second everything that's just been said. Essentially, what we are seeing happening right now is some kind of business as usual scenario, and that should not come at a big surprise. And we just heard it. It's mainly about finance. And as long as renewables are not the obvious, cheaper, more affordable option, the energy transition will remain really, really difficult. So this is why I'm emphasizing technological innovation so much, and that obviously is also why financing solutions are absolutely fundamental. And on the question, the tricky bit in particular for Europe is interdependence. Europe cannot, like perhaps the United States, say, oh, okay, we decouple from China, we become completely energy sovereign. It's not possible. We have to de-risk when it comes to our oil and gas supplies, when it comes to our relationship with China, but we cannot completely sever ties with China. And it's also not in our interest. Europe's interest is multilateralism, is international cooperation, but it's super, super difficult. There's no silver bullet, and there are individual policy choices for each and every single question. So yes, when it comes to gas, of course, we have to diversify gas supplies and supply routes. But at the same time, we have to make sure we are weaning ourselves off imported gas more and more going forward. It's incremental, it's difficult, it's expensive, but it's possible.
Sabrina, looking back for the, let's say, first 6 months of this year, which is half over now, we've seen much of just the opposite of what you're describing. So it's not that much about multilateralism, but a lot more about more fragmentism globally. We have all these debates about customs. We see corporations also in terms of climate policy get harder. Global finance of climate policies is going to get harder to organize, with the US stepping out. So the trends that we see for 2025 at least are heading in a different direction, at least from what we can see. What will this mean for 2025 in terms of economic performance, in terms of sharing knowledge on new technologies, and in the end also in progress in combating climate change to you?
It's a super difficult environment in its complexity and also in its, with its relevance for national security. But I would say, like, on the contrary, yes, we have to double down on our sovereignty in Europe. And just like so many other geographies in the world that can afford it, we need to reshore, onshore, friendshore supply chains for our energy security. But at the same time, we also have to collaborate and we have to engage in diplomacy. And, maybe it's not very easy with the United States or with China, but there are so many countries in the world that would rather work with European countries than, let's say, with China, Russia, or the US. So we have to present ourselves as the better partner for investments in green hydrogen, making sure that there are significant parts of the value chain also in the partner country. When it comes to critical resources, we have to think about deals that are simply smarter than the ones that US is proposing. And yes, it does require money and it does require goodwill and probably a lot of explaining towards the electorate, but I think it's the mindset that really matters. And that's why I'm emphasizing it so much.
One of the takeaways for me was the broad variety of pathways that we've seen and the big differences between the regions. For instance, in the speed of electrification, we saw, of course, globally quite a big speed of almost 4% electrification last year. 3.9, I think, was the figure, with China much above and other countries much below this speed. And the question to me is that just a snapshot of 2024, or are these reflections of different pathways, different strategies? To what extent electrification, for instance, plays a role in energy strategies of countries? I don't know, Géraldine or Quentin, whether you've a view on that. Is that just that some countries are faster and the others will follow? Or is that a trend that we will see also for the next years in your scenario work, or in what you can observe? What are the reasons behind these figures?
Do you want to answer maybe, Géraldine, on the different path for the different countries, and maybe I can wrap up?
Well, I was thinking about Indonesia because I mentioned it a few times, and there is a driver that we don't focus on since we are looking on energy, is nickel production. Mining production in Indonesia, especially for nickel. Indonesia is one of the largest producers of nickel in the world, about 40% of the production, and it aims to increase its share. And to refine nickel, it requires huge amounts of energy, especially coal. So this is a driver of coal demand in Indonesia. And since they have decided to boost their production, they will need huge amounts of coal, increasing demand of coal, and increasing demand for increasing emissions. So in this country, I don't see any way to decarbonize, even if they decide to go 100% renewable power generation. The need for coal in this mining sector will be so huge that CO2 emission will continue to increase. So these countries we don't think about in the first case. They may have a huge impact on emissions and on the G20. Other countries, I don't see much changes compared to what we have. We still have China and India having a very strong weight, and in Indonesia, but I don't know for any other giant coming.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a trend in electricity consumption as a whole globally going up. So as you mentioned, like plus 4% compared to plus 2% in total energy demand. So it's not exactly it, but I think you should have to look at final consumption. But I think it's also around plus 2%. So there's an increase in the share of electricity in global final consumption. In Europe, it's a little bit different. It's going down. I think to also answer the broader question in terms of what are the policies, I think there's a consensus that electricity should be a huge part of the future energy systems as a way to incorporate more to decarbonize energy demand as a whole, because this is where there's the most potential in terms of decarbonization. It's obviously in electricity, and there's a lot of electricity-based applications that make sense and that also bring energy efficiency. But currently, even if we're seeing an increase globally in terms of electricity consumption, the pace at which we're seeing most countries electrify their energy mix is too slow. And that also includes Europe. So there was this is something that you hear a lot. I think, Sabrina, you mentioned it, is well, why should we invest so much in renewables if we're seeing that electricity consumption is not raising? But that's really the wrong way of seeing the issue. You should do more to electrify energy systems and not stop investing in renewables is our position, obviously. So yeah.
And can I just briefly come in? It is, of course, a big difference whether I'm replacing existing energy infrastructure or rebuilding new. So outside the G20, what I see in Southeast Asia is a huge uptake of e-mobility, a huge uptake of decentralized renewables, simply because there is no system that I need to overcome. I build a new system straight away. So I'm finding it terribly encouraging what's happening in that region. It's way more challenging when you have to overcome an existing energy system, existing regulation, and of course, the power of incumbents.
and look into the list of participants, whether there are any questions now with what you've heard so far on the global trends, on the interpretation and the conclusions from these trends to us. So if there would be a question, please raise your hand that we can identify you, and then just tell us to whom the question should be addressed. But as far as I see for the moment, I think, is there one? No, in the chat there is one. Okay, let's see. If we compare the countries that are potential partners to Europe and US, Russia and China, how much effort and time will it take to make them competitive in the foreseeable future? Maybe to replace these three countries. So that is about diversification and the strategy. Sabrina, I think you hinted at in your conclusions what Europe should do with the current challenges, diversify, strengthen resilience. But what are the partners that we should look at? This is how I see this question. Is there any region you would recommend us to look at?
It depends on what we are looking for. Now, US, Russia, China, I mentioned is completely different. I'm still hoping that eventually the US will be a partner again for Europe. With Russia, Europe is already doing its very best to wean itself off any kind of fossil fuel imports from Russia. And there's the magical year 2027 when we want to have achieved just that. Sanctions might not be possible because Hungary will not be supporting this on the council. But I think we're making very good progress on that in Europe. And as I said, with China, decoupling really is not an option, especially due to our dependence on rare earths and critical minerals. But we can become much smarter when it comes to dealing with China, also in terms of ramping up our own trade defense measures, in terms of making sure that China brings more of its supply chains to Europe, that it invests in Europe, but hopefully with a 51% of European shares in any kind of joint venture. So there are lots of things we can do when it comes to China. And when it comes to other geographies that are also resource rich, in particular in the African continent, in my opinion, this is a direct function of how serious we are about our development cooperation. It's not about simply cutting funds. It's about being smart, and it's about having relationships on equal footing. This is not only in the interest of our partner countries that want to be treated as equals, as business partners, not as mere recipients of aid, but it's also in our interest. If we start to see this more as like of a business relationship, it can transform the relationship as well. As I said before, we want to access certain kinds of resources from a particular country. We make sure we help with investing in, let's say, processing facilities that are clean. And we just heard from Géraldine that in Indonesia, they are not clean. There's so much we can do. And it essentially means that we need to double down on our geopolitical thinking, investing resources, and also providing the manpower, the staff, the people who can actually do it. So there's plenty we can do.
Right, and if we talk about investment, it's not just about public investment, but it's really about how can we foster private investment, whether it is by new trade agreements like Mercosur, whether it is by different schemes. We're talking about Article 6 and other instruments that could help also to make private investment flows into the global south really happening, which is urgently needed as we've seen. What struggled me a bit at the beginning of the analysis was the very different speed of the different energies. I mean, you would expect from a climate policy point of view, coal to be substituted first, then oil, then gas. But what we've seen was a very different picture. We've seen a growth in coal, slight decline in oil, a sharp increase in gas and, of course, even sharper in renewables. Do you think that was an exceptional year, 2024, with the developments in the US in the oil sector that you explained, Géraldine, or is there a sort of new trend in the dynamics of these energies that you can detect?
Maybe I can say a few words on this, and don't hesitate to complement that, Géraldine. What we should perhaps do also when we do these sorts of analysis is try to isolate because you're looking at trends overall for the G20, and between that there are shifts between energies and things that you are describing. There's also structural effects. Because you have, and Géraldine mentioned that, you have countries like India and Indonesia that are gaining basically weight in the G20. So when you're seeing an energy increasing or decreasing, it's not just the result of switching from one energy to another. It's also countries like Indonesia having a huge growth economically and in terms of energy consumption, and weighing more in terms of the share of energy consumption. So I think that explains partly what we've seen for coal, for example. Another thing I would say is that there seems to be, at least in Europe, there seems to be some long-term structural effects of COVID, post-COVID, and the habits that we took after COVID in terms of transportation, especially you look at traffic, for example, it has not really recovered from before COVID. So that would explain, at least for Europe, why you would have some sort of stagnation in oil consumption. This is a good thing because we've been wondering, we've seen like the effects of COVID, and obviously there's been a huge rebound in terms of energy consumption. But we were all wondering if there were anything like, for example, remote working, and reducing commuting, working from home, and that sort of thing. These habits have seemed to decline a little bit since that period, but not fully recovered from what we had before that. And I mean, maybe I'm just being hopeful here, but maybe some sort of conscious efforts to reduce long-term traveling and things like that. Maybe something that you already see at this point. But in 2021, 2022, even 2023, it was kind of hard to identify that. In 2024, we've seen that traffic doesn't seem to have recovered, so maybe this is what we are seeing. But for coal, I would say it's mostly structural effects, but there are also other reasons behind that. I don't know if you want to complement that, Géraldine.
No, I thought that there are some inerties, I don't know what to say, but some strong weight of existing capacities for the power sector, for example, which has a huge weight in energy consumption. And in some countries, the share of coal-fired power plants is still very high. And even if they had new renewables, they still need to use their thermal power plants. We saw what happened in Spain, and which is giving some opponents to renewables some arguments to say, you see, you cannot get rid of thermal power generation. We still need thermal fossil fuels. And in some countries, there is so much coal-fired power plants and thermal power plants that they need help to replace the capacities. I'm thinking again about Indonesia, which had launched a program to add 35 gigawatts of new coal-fired power plants maybe 10 or 15 years ago. So now they have these capacities, maybe not that 35 gigawatts, but still huge capacities. And Indonesia, as other countries like Vietnam, which is also betting on coal and whose coal consumption is also rising very fast, they have entered into just energy transition programs to develop renewables and to get rid of, at their pace, of coal-fired power plants. And we saw what's happening globally on the multilateral side with the US withdrawing from this partnership. So these programs need huge amounts of investments from developed countries. And if the US are withdrawing, then the financing will need to be found. And as Sabrina said, we need huge amounts of huge investments in decarbonization. in emerging countries as in Europe.
So different ways of different countries, part of the story, well understood. On the trends of the different energies, is there sort of what we have these peak debates, when is peak gas, when is peak oil, when is peak coal to come? Do you dare already to say where we're close to that? Is that a sort of peak somewhere at the horizon, or is that too early to say from what you can observe?
Wow, I mean, people have tried to estimate when the peak oil is going to happen. I would say for coal, there's a lot of reasons to believe that we are by 2030, especially if you look at China, which is the big driver. They should have reached the peak in terms of emissions by then, and the peak in terms of coal consumption by 2030. So I would say that for coal, it's a matter of time, and obviously it's not happening as fast as we would want, but it's a matter of time. I mean, it has to be for oil as well, even though, I mean, I'm not like, again, it should have happened already, but what we have observed historically is that it's not going to be a supply-based peak, right? It's going to be based on demand, because we thought we were short on supply, but then we kept exploring and finding new ways to extract oil. So there's no limit, it seems, to how much oil we can extract. But so it's going to be a demand-based peak oil, right? So again, depending on the scenarios, and we're producing scenarios every year, but like I said earlier, we are getting away. Like each year, we are pushing back the efforts that we need to implement. So it's hard to predict when it's going to happen, but yeah, hopefully it's going to be in the next few years. For oil, I'm not as, again, there's also drivers such as traffic that seems to have been shifted a little bit recently. But for coal, I would be more confident that it's going to be in the next couple of years. For oil, probably around the same time, hopefully, but a little bit harder to say.
So Sabrina, with these trends, I guess the question from the chat, what about negative emission technologies like direct air capture, will get of more and more importance also for the next COPs and for the policy framework that we have to design, not only in Europe but also abroad. Oh.
Yes, I mean, we do need to look into negative emissions technologies, but it doesn't mean that we should be jumping to conclusions anytime soon. Let's do the research. If there are investors that want to pursue this avenue, I'm all for it. I welcome it. We will need it to some degree. But at the same time, as I said, if it's all about a business case and all about political frameworks and policies, then, if we go through oil, gas, and coal, the question needs to be asked differently. What can we do in order to reach peak oil, gas, and coal much, much earlier? For coal, it is about a just transition. It is about the jet piece and maintaining them and hopefully a rollout. For the countries that have coal, it's about domestic energy supplies, and it's about cheap supplies. And unless we can help those countries replacing cheap domestic coal with other resources, it's just going to be really challenging, but it's possible. And, same what I said about oil and the EV transition. The faster that goes, the sooner we will reach peak oil. I'm not so confident really when it comes to gas. We are approaching a time when there will be a gas glut happening in global markets. I would still, from a European perspective, advise not to bet on gas, because things can change again, and we will still be paying lots of money to other geographies for imported gas. Whereas we could just as well use those funds to invest them in our own sovereign renewables energy supplies. But yeah, so my answer is it's all about policies, and negative emissions technologies are like an insurance, which we also probably need at some point.
if I may on DAC, because I've been involved in producing our long-term energy scenarios, and I mean I think I would say something very similar to Sabrina in terms of conclusion, but there's this sort of sometimes binary way of seeing you know, decarbonization and the different options that we have. Like there's going to be one technology that's going to save us. I mean, it's not like we haven't identified a lot of different levers and drivers to allow us to reduce emissions. They're just hard to implement. I think ultimately most scenarios welcome to a different extent these sorts of technologies, but really not at the fringe. But if you look at the different options that we have for now, and there are investments, there are projects that have been going on. For now, there's a lot of uncertainty if we are able to have really large-scale DAC and that are, you know, cheap enough to be implemented into a real strategy. So it's good that we invest in all technologies that will allow us to reach our goal, but it's not going to be this magical option that is going to save us. We already know what we have to do, and we have to do it, and not just, you know, just imagine that this technology is going to save us and we don't have to shift anything in terms of energy mix and also the way we consume energy. So the less we rely on these technologies for which there is a high level of uncertainty, the better, I would say, when building a strategy to decarbonize energy systems.
But we have to do many things at once. That's for sure. Absolutely. It's my last call for questions, and if I don't see any at this point in time, I'd like to thank all of you, all the three of you, Géraldine, Sabrina, Quentin, for your contributions. I think that was really most interesting, and what you've seen and heard can be found on our website, I think today already, with the slides on this chapter. All of the Energie für Deutschland, Energy for Germany publication will be published on 10th of July, as I said, with the main chapter on CCS technologies and trends globally. And to add another preview, there will be on the 30th of June another webinar on a global survey that we did on how is Germany Energiewende actually perceived by other countries and other people that look at us. Are we still serving as a good example? Are there at least elements that are influencing other energy transitions? So stay with us. Thank you very much for all of your attention, and see you soon then. Bye-bye.